Psychoanalytic notes on an autobiographical account of a case of paranoia, dementia paranoïde. Ça veut pas être... Ça fonctionne pas pour William. Oui, c'est faisable, mais pas à lire là puis le contrôler d'ici. Je crois que ça va être problématique. Poser où est-ce que c'est symbolique. Yeah, approprié quand tu seras prêt. Sérieux. The present translation is reissued with a number of corrections and additional notes of the one published in 1925. Schreber's memoirs were published in 1903, but though they had been widely discussed in psychiatric circles, they seem not to have attracted Freud's attention until the summer of 1910. He is known to have talked of them, and of the whole question of paranoia, during his Sicilian tour with Ferenczi in September of that year. On his return to Vienna, he began writing his paper, and letters dated December 16th to both Abraham and Ferenczi announced its completion. It seems not to have been published till the summer of 1911. The postscript was read before the Third International Psychoanalytical Congress held at Weimar on September 22nd, 1911, and was published at the beginning of the next year. Freud had attacked the problem of paranoia at a very early stage of his researches into psychopathology. On January 24th, 1895, some months before the publication of the studies on hysteria, he sent Fliess a long memorandum on the subject. This included a short case history and a theoretical discussion, which aimed at establishing two main points: that paranoia is a neurosis of defense, and that its chief mechanism is projection. Almost a year later, on January 1st, 1896, he sent Fliess another, much shorter, note on paranoia. This formed part of a general account of the neuroses of defense, which he soon afterwards expanded into his second published paper bearing that title, 1896b. In its published form, section 3 of this paper included another and longer case history was headed Analysis of a Case of Chronic Paranoia, a case for which Freud in a footnote added a nearly 20 years later preferred the amended diagnosis of dementia paranoid. As regards theory, this paper of 1896 added little to his earlier suggestions, but in a letter to Fliess not very long afterwards, December 9th, 1899, letter 125, a somewhat cryptic paragraph occurs which gives a hint of Freud's later views, including a suggestion that paranoia involves a return to an early autoerotism. It will be found quoted in full in the editor's note to the paper on the disposition of obsessional neurosis, in connection with the problem of choice of neurosis. Between the date of this last passage and the publication of the Schreber case history, more than 10 years elapsed, with scarcely a mention of paranoia in Freud's published writings. We learned from Ernest Jones However, that on November 21st, 1906, he presented a case of female paranoia before the Vienna Psychoanalytical Society. At that date, he had apparently not yet arrived at what was to be his main generalization on the subject, namely, the connection between paranoia and repressed passive homosexuality. Nevertheless, only a little over a year later, he was putting forward that hypothesis in Letters to Jung, January 27th, 1908, and Ferenczi, February 11th, 1908, and was asking for and receiving their confirmation of it. More than 3 more years elapsed before the Schreber memoirs offered him the opportunity of publishing his theory for the first time and of supporting it by a detailed account of his analysis of the unconscious processes at work in paranoia. There are a number of references to that disease in Freud's later writings. The more important of these were his paper on a case of paranoia, running counter to the psychoanalytical theory of the disease, and section B of some neurotic mechanism, jealousy, paranoia, and homosexuality. In addition, a 17th century demonological neuroses includes some discussion of Schreber case, though the neurosis which is the subject of the paper is nowhere described by Freud as paranoia. In none of these later writings is there any essential modification of the views on paranoia expressed in the present work. The importance of the Schreber analysis, however, is by no means restricted to the light it throws on the problems of paranoia. Its third section, in particular, was, together with the simultaneously published short paper on the 2 principles of mental functioning, page 218 below, in many ways a forerunner of the metapsychological papers on which Freud embarked 3 or 4 years later. A number of subjects are touched upon which were to be discussed afterwards at greater length. Thus, the remarks on narcissism were preliminary to the paper devoted to that subject. The account of the mechanism of repression was to be taken up again in the course of a few years, and the discussion of instincts was feeling its way towards the more elaborate one, instincts and their vicissitudes. The paragraph on projection, on the other hand, was not, in spite of its promise, to find any sequel. Each of the 2 topics discussed in the later part of the paper, however, the various causes of the onset of neurosis, including the concept of frustration, and the part played by successive points of fixation, was to be dealt with before long in a separate paper. Finally, in the postscript, we find Freud's first brief excursion into the field of mythology, and his first mention of totems, which were beginning to occupy his thoughts, and which were to give the title to one of his principal works. As Freud tells us, his case history makes use of only a single fact: Schreber's age at the time when he fell ill, that was not contained in the memoirs. We now possess, thanks to a paper written by Dr. Franz Baumeier, a quantity of additional information. Dr. Baumeier was, for some years, in charge of a hospital near Dresden, where he found a quantity of the original case records of Schreber's successive illnesses. He has summarized these records and quoted many of them in full. In addition to this, he has collected a large number of facts concerning Schreber's family history and antecedents, where any of this material seems to be directly relevant to Freud's paper, it will be found mentioned in the footnotes. Here it is only necessary to report the sequel to the history narrated in the memoirs. After his discharge, at the end of 1902, Schreber seems to have carried on an outwardly normal existence for some years. Then, in November 1907, his wife had a stroke. Though she lived until 1912, this seems to have precipitated a fresh onset of his illness, and he was readmitted, this time to an asylum in the Deusen district of Leipzig. A fortnight later, he remained there in an extremely disordered and largely inaccessible state until his death, after gradual physical deterioration in the spring of 1911. Only a short time before the publication of Freud's paper, the following chronological table, based on data derived partly from the memoirs and partly from Baumeyer's material, may make the details in Freud's discussion easier to disentangle. (1842) July 25th, Daniel Paul Schreber, born at Leipzig. 1861. November, father died, aged 53. 1877. Elder brother, 3 years his senior, died, aged 38. 1878. Married. First illness. 1884. Autumn stood as a candidate for the Reichstag. 1. It appears from a letter to a Princess Mary Bonaparte, written by Freud on September 13th, 1926, and published in part in the 3rd volume of Ernest Jones' biography, that he had been informed of this relapse and its occasion, among other things, through a Dr. Steekman, though he made no mention of it in his paper. See footnotes on page 46 and 51 below. 2. At this time, Schreber was already filling an important judicial office as judge presiding over the Landgericht, a court of inferior jurisdiction at Chemnitz. After recovering from his first illness, he occupied a similar position in the Landgericht in Leipzig. Just before his second illness, he was appointed presiding judge over a division of the Saxon Appeal Court in Dresden. 1884. October. For some weeks in Sonnenstein Asylum. December 8th. Leipzig Psychiatric Clinic. 1885. June 1st. Discharged. 1886. January 1st. Took up appointment in Leipzig. Landgericht. Second illness. 1893. June. Informed of approaching appointment to appeal court. October 1st. Took up appointment as presiding judge. November 21st. readmitted to Leipzig Clinic. June 14th, transferred to Lindenhof Asylum. June 29th, transferred to Sonnenstein Asylum. 1900 to 1902, wrote memoirs and took legal action for his discharge. 1902, July 14th, court judgment of discharge. December 20th, discharged. 1903, memoirs published. Third illness. May. Died. Age 92. November 14th. Wife had a stroke. Fell ill immediately afterwards. November 27th. Admitted to asylum at Leipzig, Duisburg. 1911. April 14th. Died. 1912. May. Wife died, aged 54. A note on the 3 mental hospitals referred to in various ways in the text may also be of help. 1. Psychiatric Clinic and Patient Department of the University of Leipzig. Director, Professor Flitsch. 2. Sonnenstein, Saxon State Asylum, Pirna, on the Elbe, 10 miles above Dresden. Director, Dr. G. Weber. 3. Leidenhof, Private Asylum, near Fußvik, 11 miles. And W. of Dresden. Director, Dr. Pearson. An English translation of Gilten by Dr. Ida McAlpine and Dr. Richard A. Hunter was published in 1955, London, William Dawson. For various reasons, some of which will be obvious to anyone comparing their version with ours, it has not been possible to make use of it for many quotations from Schreber's book, which occur in the case history. There were clearly special difficulties in translating the productions of schizophrenics, in which words, as Freud himself pointed out in his paper on the unconscious, play such a dominant part. Here the translator is faced by the same problems that meet him so often in dreams, slips of the tongue and jokes. In all these parts, the method adopted in the standard edition is the pedestrian one of where necessary giving the original German words and footnotes and endeavoring by means of explanatory comment to allow an English reader some opportunity of forming an opinion of his own on the material. At the same time, it would be misleading to disregard outward forms entirely and to present, through purely literal translation, an uncouth picture of Schreber's style. One of the remarkable features of the original is the contrast it perpetually offers between the involved and elaborate sentences of official, academic 19th century German and outré extravagances of the psychotic events which they describe. Through this paper, figures and brackets with no preceding page references to the original German edition of Schreber's Memoirs. Denkwürdigkeiten eines Nervenkranken. Leipzig, Oswald Mutzke. Figures and brackets with the preceding P are, as always in the standard edition, references to pages in the present volume.